All right, we are looking at Psalm 47, 49, 50, 47, 48, 49, and 50, those four Psalms tonight. These are relative Psalms, but there's a great deal of information, particularly in Psalm 49 and Psalm 50. Very practical Psalms. So we are ready for Psalm 47. And so our handout is looking for the type of psalm, then the author, and then the message of the psalm. And then we'll talk about an outline, and then we'll, at the end, list some practical things. Psalm 47. What did you list for the type of psalm? Well, it's a psalm of praise. You might classify it in some other fashion, but generally it is a psalm of praise. Author? Sons of Korah, as we have seen in the last several Psalms. We've already talked about them. What's the message or the subject? All right, praise to God for being the ruler of the earth and ruler over the nations. That is the point. So he's the ruler of the earth. That seems to be the point of the psalm. Some have outlined this in 3 or 4 sections. We outline it here in 2, and I'll give you an alternative outline here in just a moment that Jensen gives in 3 sections. But God is the ruler of the earth. Psalm 46, 47, where we are. 46 we covered last week. 47 tonight. And then in a moment we're going to look at Psalm 48, is likely dealing with the same circumstance or the same occasion. So we made the point, though we cannot be dogmatic, there's not 100% evidence of this, that this may have reference to 2 Kings 19, when there was a problem with the invasion of Sennacherib, and then later in 2 Kings 19, there is the defeat of Sennacherib. But be that as it may, Psalm 46 talks about one who is in trouble, and God is our, look at verse 1 of Psalm 46 now, God is our refuge and strength and a very present help in trouble. So there seems to be some national trouble, some problem, where God is going to be the answer to that. We saw that God is in our midst when the enemy comes. We saw that in verses 4 to 7. Look at verse 7, the Lord of hosts is with us. And I only mention all of that to suggest to you that we seem to think, at least some think, that maybe Psalm 47 and 48 may be dealing with the same occasion, or a similar occasion to say the least. Well, it does seem to follow on the heels. Here is a problem of one who is looking for consolation and help in time of trouble. And then in 46, God is ruler over all. Then when we get to 48, there's going to be celebration for this deliverance that we'll talk about. So anyway, let's work through 47 now. 2 things happen here. One is God rules over and defeats the nations. Now, we thread some things together in this first 4 verses that I think are going to be very helpful to us. Look at verse 1. Oh, clap your hands, all you people. Shout to God with the voice of triumph, for the Lord Most High is awesome, awe-inspiring. Your translation may say He's terrible. That doesn't, and that's not a mistranslation. It is not the idea that God's a bad God. He's awe-inspiring. He's terrible in that sense that He indeed is this awesome God. One writer made the observation at verse 1 where it says, clap your hand, all you people, that if the Gentiles understood, which he's calling for all people to praise God, if the Gentiles understood what God was accomplishing with His nation of Israel, they would rejoice with any success that Israel had. They didn't understand that. So what God was doing with the nation from the point of creation was God was building finally a nation by Genesis 12 through whom the Messiah was going to come, through which all men could be saved. And so if the nations understood, that is the Gentiles were to understand, I'll make the point again, if they understood what God was going to accomplish through the success of his nation, the Jews, they would rejoice in any success of the Jewish nation. Make sense? They didn't fully understand that. But nonetheless, clap your hands, all you people. Now notice at verse 2, and we'll see it again at verse 7, is the key and a summary of what's going on. And that is, he is the great king over all the earth. God rules over all. Now, how does that relate? Just stop there for a moment with the problem that we saw in Psalm 46. There seems to be some national threat, some time of trouble, some threat of another nation. And how does this help with that? It shows God's in control. God not only rules the nation we're in, God not only rules the nation of the Jews, God also rules all the nations. God rules over all the earth. And therefore something is to be concluded. That's where we get to verse 3. I think verse 3, if we loosely, this would not be a good translation, but loosely paraphrased it, verse 3 would begin with, therefore. The Lord is ruler over all, therefore he will subdue the people under us. There is a threat of an enemy nation, Sennacherib seemingly. And here is this defeat seemingly that's on our heels here. And can we conquer Sennacherib, and can we be successful over the Assyrians? Can we do that? God is ruler over all. Therefore, he will subdue the people under us, and all nations under his feet. He will choose our inheritance for us, the excellence of Jacob, or the pride of Jacob, whom he loves. Now, there's a lot in that. Let's unpack that. What is he talking about when he talks about he'll choose our inheritance for us? Absolutely. And stop and think about this now, that evidence that God is ruler over all, I think he's arguing from the conquest and the promise and the fulfillment of the conquest. Does that make sense? How do I know God rules over all? Well, one, he said so. But secondly, I know God is ruler over the nations because when God promised the land, they were given the land, given every bit of it. Does that make sense? The conquest shows God ruled over the nations. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the God over all the nations. He controls all the nations. Now, I don't think that at verse 3 and 4 he's merely talking about the present circumstance, but uses the past circumstance of the conquest to argue for what takes place now. Now let's back up to 46 again and look at verse 1 and then verse 3 and verse 6. Verse 1, there is trouble. Verse 3, though the waters roar and are troubled. We're on troubled waters right now. Verse 6, the nations raged and the kingdoms were removed. Nations are working against us. How do I know we're going to be all right in the midst of this? Because God is ruler over all. Evidence? The conquest. Does that make sense? All right. All right. Now then, let's go back now to beginning at verse 5. God rules over and defeats the nation. Now verses 5 to 9, what's his point? Absolutely. Absolutely. Look at verse 5. God has gone up with a shout. What does that mean? God has gone up with a shout. All right. All right. Say again. All right. He proclaims victory because he's already victorious. I like the wording of the NET here at verse 5. That's what I was looking for. God has ascended to his throne. The idea of, let me go back and find my verse. God has gone up with a shout is the idea of God ascending. And your translation may say ascending. So I'm reading from the NET, which is a little more wooden translation, that God has ascended to his throne amid loud shouts. Now, God's always been on his throne, but in this conflict, it's as if God ascended to his throne and took control. Does that make sense? God arose to his throne, and he did it with great shouts. There's great proclamation. And the Lord with the sound of the trumpet. So it wasn't that God just kind of works in the background over here, but God ascended to his throne with shouts and with praise and with the sounding of a trumpet. So therefore, sing praises to God, sing praises to the King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth. That's why he should be praised. Sing praises with understanding. Now what do you see in verses 8 and 9? Yeah, he reigns over the nations. He sits on the holy throne, and the princes are gathered together, and the people of the God of Abraham, for the shield of the earth belong to God. He's to be greatly exalted. In other words, God is in control of all. God takes care of his people. God is ruling over the nations and preserving his people. But I think verse 8 could serve as a good summary. God reigns over the nations and he sits on his holy throne. All right, questions or comments on that before we look at practical lessons? Jensen outlines that in 3 points. I like how he did this, though I like the other outline better. That God's reign over all the earth was prophesied. That's prophesied in the history that we talked about in verse 3. It was celebrated, verses 5 to 7, and it's inaugurated in verses 8 and 9. Not a bad outline. Practical things we take home with us from Psalm 47. What do you learn? What else? God. One of the reasons to praise God is the fact that he is in control. What else? Absolutely. Look at the history of what God has done. That gives us evidence of what he's doing now and what he'll do in the future. What else? Psalm 47. All right. Good point. Need to sing with understanding. Praise with understanding. Jensen raises this in his little practical section, and I'm paraphrasing, is God king over all in your life? We praise God for being king over all, but is he over all? Is God king over all your thoughts? Is God king over all your deeds? Is God king over all your words? Pretty good question, isn't it? Say, God reigns over all. Are you letting him reign over your thoughts? Are you letting him reign over your deeds and over your words and every aspect over your home? Or do you just let him work and reign over your worship? Or you say, well, I'm letting him reign over my home too. I'm letting him rule my home. He is controlling all. Anything else on Psalm 47? Good point. Good point. He has an inheritance he's holding out, and will deliver that to us. Good point. All right, let's go to Psalm 48 now. So what type of psalm is this? Psalm 48. All right, could be listed as praise. What else? Deliverance. It's a psalm about deliverance. Thanksgiving or praise for that deliverance. Author, Sons of Korah again, and the theme or message or subject. Yeah. Thanksgiving for this deliverance, or some have referred to this as the city of God. The city of God delivered, we call it here. The city of God delivered. We have here the city of God delivered from adversity, verses 1 to 8. The God of the city is praised for defeat. Now, this seems to be the same occasion, and you want me to argue the case. I won't, because I'm not sure I can, but I think it's logical in that the Psalms appear together, that Psalm 46, 47, and 48, because there seems to be a progression of thought. There is a problem, 46. There is a solution seen in the fact that God's on his throne, and then there's deliverance. So if the occasion is the same, this may, and I underline the word may, refer to 2 Kings chapter 19. When there was defeat over Sennacherib's army, then consequently there is deliverance that came, and God's to be praised for that. All right, let's work through this. There's some practical things we're going to learn. Let's talk about verses 1 to 8. The city of God was delivered. He says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God." And so we could just stop at this juncture. And what I'm learning about the city of God is what makes it glorious is that God's there. Yeah, that God is there. Beautiful in elevation, verse 2. The joy of the whole earth, Mount Zion. The city of the great king. God is in her palaces. So God is in the palaces of this great city. Again, God is what makes the city glorious. Jerusalem was glorious only because God would dwell in the city. That makes sense? When they forget about God and they push God aside, God leaves the city. Remember in the book of Ezekiel where the glory of God left the temple, and then finally the city's destroyed? Well, because God's not there anymore. All right. Now beginning at verse 4, the city was delivered by God. So the psalm seems to be, if our timing be correct, of 2 Kings 19, and these are threaded together. These three psalms are dealing with, as we mentioned last week, they may form a trilogy. If that be the case, then here this praise is being given to God because he delivered the city. So God was there in the city. That's what brought the deliverance, and therefore it's delivered by God. So what do we see in verses 4 through 8? Now remember, this is in poetry form. This is much like a song being written about something in our day and time. It's not exact wording, not exactly what plays out, but it's a poetic picture of what plays out.
These kings came together to advance on the city, but when they saw it, they were tributary.
All right, yeah. These were kings. Now you say, well, I thought it was King Sennacherib. These are probably vassal kings, underling kings, for lack of better expression, that ruled under the Assyrian emperor. That they come and they assembled and they trembled and they just fled away. And fear took hold of them as a woman and birth pangs, verse 6. And as you have heard and you've seen in the city of the Lord of hosts is the city of our God. God will establish it forever. In other words, God delivered the city, but people were afraid because they saw the power of God there. Make sense? That's the picture in the psalm. It's like they came to the city. They see this is the city of God. God's power is there, and they're defeated and they run away. And that's the praise for that. Now then, let's talk about the God of the city is being praised now for this defeat. So thanks be given to God, verses 9 and 10. We have thought, O God, on your loving kindness in the midst of your temple, according to your name, O God. So is your praise in the ends of the earth. And I notice at verse 10, Your right hand is full of righteousness. What does that suggest to you? First of all, before we talk about righteousness, generally the right hand referred to what? Power, yeah. God's power. Now, your right hand is full of righteousness. What might that phrase express? God is being praised in this context for his right hand being full of righteousness. Say again? Justice, yeah. I think that's the point. God's right hand, his power brings justice. Does that make sense? That here the people of God, the city of God is under attack, and God is being praised because God's in the city, and his justice is what brings the defeat of the enemy. And so God is a God of justice. That's the point of that. So let Mount Zion rejoice and the daughters of Judah be glad because of your judgments. Make sense? Leupold makes an observation here at verse 11. If men over the world, by the way, beginning at verse 9, the call is for let all men praise God for this. Leupold makes this observation. If men over the world, whenever they hear the Lord, what has done for Israel, they should break out in praises, he said. Men should break out in praises because of what God has done for Zion. And we made that point earlier, but I think that's worthy of our acknowledgement at verse 11. Now then, beginning at verse, continuing through verse 14 to finish that, what else do we see? God is being praised, and so there's rejoicing going on in Jerusalem, and so the people who've been delivered are told to walk about in Zion, go all around her, and do what? Inspect the city, count her towers, see her bulwarks. We'll come back to what that is in a moment. And consider her palaces. And then what do? Tell it to the next generation. So the focus is on the city of God, and now this is the God of the city that's being praised. I think Leupold is correct when he made the observation. It was not an emphasis on the invincible bulwarks. The emphasis is not on the walls, the towers, the citadels, or the bastions, but in fact regarding what kind of God this God is that delivered. So look around the city and see that it was delivered. Look at her bulwarks, look at her towers, and you tell the next generation what took place. Now, there are several practical things we can learn from that. So let's go to our practical things that you may have listed here at Psalm 48. What do you learn from that? Say again. All right, we're secure when we're aligned with God. That's the only reason God defends this city. God did not always defend this city, did he? Did he not let Babylon take the city and destroy the city? God didn't always defend the city. There were times he did. This occasion he did. 2 Kings 19 in the days of Hezekiah. But we must be aligned with God if we're going to be defended. What else do we learn? Yeah. Tell it to the next generation. And what they were to tell is what God had done. I don't think the emphasis, and I think Leupold is correct, I don't think the emphasis is go look at her towers and then make sure the next generation understands all about the towers. Make sure the next generation understands all about the details of the city. And forget about telling them about God, just tell them about the tower. No. You tell them what God did. You tell them how God defended this city. You tell them how God used these bulwarks and the towers and the citadels, etc., to defend this city. And so the one generation tells the next generation. And at some point, when that chain breaks, what do we got? Generation that doesn't know God. Judges 2 and verse 10. Make sense? So have you told the next generation? Have you told your children? And if not, are you making plans to tell your children? That's a good question, isn't it? All right, what else do we learn from this psalm? All right, God is worthy of all praise. Let's look at this word bulwarks. You might underline this. Mark ye well her bulwarks and tell it to the next generation. What is a bulwark? It's a rampart. That helps you a lot, doesn't it? Fortification, defense structures. That's what that is. There are certain things the city had that were its defenses. And when those defenses are gone, the protection of the city is gone. Does that make sense? Mark her bulwarks. Take note of that. Mark well her bulwarks. I think there's a spiritual application to Zion. The bulwarks are our protection and our strength. And we need to mark those bulwarks and tell it to the next generation. First principles are our bulwarks. First principles are our bulwarks. For example, something like we have no creed but the Bible. Or maybe that there's no organization but the church. Or there's no worship but what's found in the Word. Those basic first principles are our bulwarks and our strength. And if we don't mark well our bulwarks, what's going to happen? The defense will be gone and we're in trouble. And that's happened time and again. Anything else on Psalm 48 before we go to Psalm 49? Psalm 49's got a lot of stuff in it we want to talk about. So let's go to Psalm 49. What type of psalm is this? It's instruction, didactic. Some have classified it as wisdom. So if you put something along the line of instructional, didactic, teaching, it is an instructional, teaching psalm, a psalm of wisdom, teaching you about wisdom. Author, sons of Korah again. Message or subject. Say again. Vanity of riches. Very good, yes. The limitation of riches, I've called it. The vanity of riches. How riches have limitations. Now, the psalmist is puzzled, as is, we find this puzzle all through the scriptures, about how the prosperity of the godless. That's not an uncommon theme in the Bible, about those who are godly, are godless rather, the ungodly, the wicked are prospering. Why do the wicked prosper? The question is raised time and again. But he's more concerned about how he's oppressed by those who abuse their wealth. So the point here is to console people who are oppressed by the wealthy. But the problem here is solved by pointing to the future. Pulpit make the observation, the problem is solved more distinctly than anywhere else in the Psalms by the doctrine of compensation in a future life. And I agree with that. Probably more than any other psalm, this points to future life. Leupold said, basically his argument boils down to this, that death is the great leveler. What is not adjusted in this life and world is adjusted in the next. And I think this psalm makes that point. Make sense? All right, so here's what we have in Psalm 49. There is the problem is riches, the limitation of riches. The need for instruction, the occasion for the instruction, and then there's the instruction. So let's work through this, because I want us to have time to get, and we will, I think, Psalm 50 briefly. So let's quickly work through Psalm 49. So what we have in Psalm 49, verses 1 and 2, for whom is this instruction? And who does he say it's for? All people. So rich or poor, the high and the low, whoever. Everybody needs to hear this. So this is who this instruction's for. Well, what is it that we're going to get? Well, he says, my mouth will speak wisdom. That's the insight to be able to see beyond the present. I don't mean be able to see into the future as much as James 1:5 uses the term wisdom in this sense. James is making the point that suffering has a benefit down the line. And if I can't see there's some benefit down the line, I'm lacking in wisdom. So I need to ask wisdom of God. I need to be able to see beyond the cloud and the smoke to see something in the future. And so you look around and you look at the prospering of the wicked and you think, well, this is all that there's going on. No. Look beyond the cloud and the smoke, and that's wisdom, looking beyond. Now, and that we may have understanding. I take that to be understanding to deal with the circumstance. So what instruction is coming? Wisdom to deal with this problem of the prosperity of the wicked. And the result is going to be, according to verse 4, this understanding. Now this is interesting that I will incline my ear to the proverb and I will disclose my dark saying on the harp. Here is that the information and the wisdom that settles a vexing question. And so what the psalmist is saying is that here is some wisdom that settles this vexing question, gives you wisdom how to deal with that. How do you handle that? When you're doing everything you can to be right, and it seems like you're not prospering, but here's a wicked person that just seems to everything they touch turns to gold. That don't seem right. And maybe they are oppressing you. We'll talk more about that at verse 6 here in a moment. All right. Now then, here's the occasion, verses 5 and 6. There's the oppression, and then the oppressors. So what happens at verse 5? The oppression. He is surrounded by his enemies, surrounded by evil. Evil and iniquity surrounds him. All around me is evil. Verse 6. He is oppressed by those who put their trust in riches. Now, you say, well, I don't know that I'm being oppressed by that. Well, that might be an employer for you. It might be a friend that flaunts their wealth. Or it may be the merchant that takes advantage of you. It may be a dictator that rules with an iron fist. It may be a wealthy person or a group of people that treat you like you're unimportant. You may be oppressed in some sense by some that you may think of or picture as being wealthy. That's the occasion for the instruction. So here is the instruction now that's going to give us wisdom. 3 things he says. First is the folly of riches. Beginning at verse 7, he makes the point that here's something you can't buy. So this is going to help us when we see people that are wealthy and maybe they're not treating us as they treat us as unimportant, or maybe we're being oppressed somehow. Remember this. None of them can by any means redeem his brother. That's not, I think, talking about spiritual redemption. I think in context that money cannot prevent death, I think is the point. And I'll give you more evidence of that as we go on. In other words, you take the richest person on earth and the top class of people, the multi-billionaires, and they're going to die just like everybody else. They can't go to the doctor and say, here's $1 billion and I'm going to pay that, so keep me from dying. It ain't going to happen. It just doesn't work. All right? For the redemption of their soul is costly, nor God gives them a ransom for him. So, in other words, they're going to end up dying. I want to drop down to verse 9, that he should continue to live eternally and not see the pit, that is death. So there's not a rich person can then say, you know what, let me shell out some money and I'm not going to die. I'm going to live forever because of the amount of money I have. It ain't going to happen. There's just some things money can't buy. And health isn't one of them, and life isn't one of them. And so that's part of the folly of riches. Now, so verse 10 through 13, what's he say about those who have wealth? Every wealthy person does this. They leave it all behind. For he sees a wise men die, likewise the foolish and the senseless person, they leave their wealth to others. And their dwelling places to all the generations. So the point, and that gets us down through the end of verse 13, he's like the beast, he perishes. In other words, he can't ward off death, and when he dies, he leaves it all. And so death is that great leveler, as Leupold said. It's a great equalizer. That you are in poverty, and this guy's a billionaire. When you die, y'all are on the same level. It's a great leveler. Make sense? So that's part of the folly of putting your trust and your confidence in riches. So he said, that's the folly of trusting in riches. Now, verses 14 and 15, here's the value of righteousness. Like sheep they are laid in the grave. Death shall feed on them. The upright shall leave the dominion over, The upright shall have dominion over them in the morning, and their beauty shall be consumed in the grave, far from their dwelling. But God will redeem the soul from the power of the grave, and he shall receive me. What's that talking about? The resurrection, I think. Some have argued that there is no concept of life beyond in the Old Testament, and I deny that. I think here's a case in point. Job talked about if a man die, shall he live again? And he had this Redeemer, Job 19, that was going to deliver him. I think that's what he's talking about here in Psalm 49, that they both died and they lay down together, but the righteous has this advantage that he rises in the morning with an advantage over the poor, over the rich rather, that had oppressed him, the wicked, the rich, who were wicked. Does that make sense? So there's value in righteousness more than riches. So your righteousness can't make you live forever, but it can make you live eternally forever. But your riches can't do either one. So there's more value in righteousness than there is in riches. That's the point. All right? Now then, verses 16 to 20, his point is, don't be afraid of the rich and the riches. What's his point here? Yeah. Don't be mesmerized. Don't be captivated. Don't be afraid of them. Now, can the rich use their riches to make life harder for you? Sure they can. Sure they can. But don't get all bent out of shape about that, because they're putting their confidence in riches and you're putting your confidence in righteousness, and the righteousness will pay off and the riches are going to be left. So notice at verse 17, that when he dies, he shall carry nothing away. He doesn't carry any money with him. Wherever he goes, he doesn't carry money with him. His glory shall not descend. Notice people will praise him, though, while he's here. Though while he lives, he blesses himself. That is, he may praise himself about how rich he is. For men will praise you when you have done well for yourself. They'll call you a success. Or they're going to talk about what a success he is. This is the guy you need to listen to. He knows how to handle money. And so they'll praise you as being a success. But then he shall go to the generation of his fathers. What does that mean? He's going to die. Yeah, he's going to die like everybody else. Makes sense? Well, now, we didn't touch everything in the psalm, but that's a powerful psalm about the limitation of riches. There's the need for instruction. Everybody needs it. Here's the occasion, being oppressed. But here's the 3 points. That is, there's folly in putting your confidence in riches. Here's the value of righteousness, and don't be afraid of the rich. Don't let them intimidate you. You know where the value is. They may think you don't have anything of value, and yet you've got something far more valuable than they do. Make sense? Practical things you take with you from Psalm 49. Say again, I'm sorry. Good connection, good connection. I meant to mention that. Glad you did. 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 to 10. We brought nothing into this world, we carry nothing out. Good point. Which the point there was that we need to be content because of that. All right, anything else on Psalm 49? We're going to take just a little bit on Psalm 50. All right. Let's go to Psalm 50. What kind of psalm is this? It's an instructional psalm. The author is Asaph, and the point or the message? God is a righteous judge. It deals with judgment. So let's see what happens in this psalm. Now, there's 23 verses here, but I think we can quickly get through the point. I want us to get to the heart and the core of that. And he starts with a call to judgment. This seems to be a psalm of calling God's people to judgment. Now, there's a sense in which God is the judge over all the earth. We saw that in Psalm 47, and he will judge all the earth. But this seems to be a call of his people. And we'll see more about that in the next section down here, verses 7 to 15. So he calls all to come from the rising of the sun to its going down, and that is all men are to come. And here's what God's going to do. A fire shall devour. I'm reading at verse 3. A fire shall devour before him. In other words, God's coming with righteous indignation. So God is going to be indignant in this judgment that he comes. But notice at verse 4. Now we're still talking about this call to judgment. He shall call the heavens from above into the earth that he may do what? Might underline this. Judge his people. He might judge his people. So gather the saints together, and those who have made a covenant with him, this is his people, and the heavens will declare, for God himself is judge. So all men are called before God to be judged and call his people before him because God's going to judge them. Make sense? So God's call for judgment. Now, there are two things that are going to be examined. Their worship and their walk. First of all, their worship. Now, God said, I'm going to testify against you. I will not reprove you for your sacrifices or your burnt offerings, which are continually before me. What's his point?
The worshiping by the letter of the law, the truth.
All right, they were doing that. So what's he saying? And that's a very good point. What's he saying? My problem is not absolutely. It is not what you did, it's how you did that. Make sense? So he says, I don't have anything against your burnt offerings. I'm paraphrasing verse 8. I'm not going to reprove you for your sacrifice and your burnt offerings, which you continue to bring before me. That's not the problem. Okay, what's the problem? I will not take your bull from your house, nor your goats from your folds. For every beast of the forest is mine. What's the problem here that he's describing? Or what's the implication?
They believe that God is indebted to them because they're giving these things to God, and they all belong to him.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're offering their sacrifice to God as though God needed that sacrifice. As if God needs that from him. Again, it's not what they did, it's the attitude and the thought with which they did that. So God said, I don't have a problem, verse 8, with your sacrifice. I'm not going to reprove you for your sacrifice and your burnt offerings, but I don't need your sacrifice and your burnt offerings because, notice verse 10, every beast is mine. The wild beasts of the field are mine. Verse 11, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. Verse 10. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for all the world's mine. In other words, I wouldn't come to you begging. If I were a human that was begging, I wouldn't come to you because it all belongs to me. Your attitude is, you need to give this to me because I need it. It already is mine. It's your attitude. That make sense? So, God's people are called to judgment because their attitude in worship. Now that hits home because what I'm doing in worship, I'm making application to us. May not be a thing wrong with what I'm doing. I may not be worshiping with an instrument. I may not be counting beats. I may be singing songs of praise. I may be praying the right words. I may be taking of the right elements, but, finish my sentence. My attitude may not be right. My thoughts may be in the wrong place. My motive may be wrong. And God may say, it's not the Lord's Supper. That ain't the problem here. It's how you observe the Lord's Supper. It's not your prayer. It's how you observe that prayer. It's not your giving. It's the attitude with which you give. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Then their walk is examined. He begins at verse 16 listing their sins. And so let's quickly notice this. They rejected his word. They take my covenant and you hate my instruction. They live like the world. In other words, they were living like everybody else. You consent with him and you become a partaker. In other words, you just go along with what everybody else is doing and you have a dishonor for others. Now let's get to verse 21. What's the reason for that? Again, had to do with their thinking. They didn't think God cared about that. They didn't think God took notice. You thought I was like everyone else, and that I would ignore that, and I wouldn't see it, or I don't care about that. And so their thinking got them in trouble. So God calls them to judgment. And finally, we're going to close by noticing 22 and 23. The wicked will be destroyed and the righteous will be saved. One or two practical lessons, all we have time for. What do you learn from Psalm 50? Might as well not do it. Good point. What else? Practical, take home. All right. We don't need to think we're getting away because God is silent. It's not always what we do, it may be how we do that. Psalm 51, a penitential psalm we're going to get into. Very interesting psalm. And Psalm 53, 52, 53, and 54 next time.